state. She worked at Illegal Aid Services of Oklahoma, where she was fostering access to justice for indigent survivors of domestic abuse and civil litigation, and developing an eviction defense docket during the COVID pandemic. I'm an attorney at Ice Miller here in Chicago in our White Collar and Government Investigations group, and I went to this law school and just ran into my first year contracts professor, and I'm still processing the terror from that. So I'll hand it over to I think Jillian for some opening remarks on how we can kind of cognize and think about the cannabis market, which includes a lot of different segments.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks to INCBA for having me, for having us, for having this panel. This is a tough topic. It's not a topic with easy answers, but I wanted to make some opening remarks because I think as we have this conversation, it's really important to acknowledge that the market is not a monolith and it's not one thing, and I think we have at least 6 different markets. I'm going to list off some of the ones that come to mind and then tell you why I think that's important. So we have the legacy market that's existed for a long time in this country. We have the state-regulated cannabis market. We have diversion from the state-regulated cannabis market. We have the federally legal cannabinoid hemp market. We have an illicit market that has grown around some of the federally legal hemp stuff. And then we do still have international drug cartels operating in some states. You might hear about some of that today. So those are at least 6 different markets. And I think as we talk about this, it's really important to recognize that regulatory authorities to deal with those markets in states differ greatly, as well as goals. You know, we have a number of states in our CANRA membership that are actively working with the legacy market to move the legacy market into a regulated space. We also have a number of states in our CANRA membership who are actively working on issues with international drug cartels that do still exist and involve a lot of other issues, you know, human trafficking, trafficking of weapons, environmental, you know, laws that are being broken. So it's hard to talk about this issue without first setting the table so that everyone acknowledges that we have a lot of different markets, that the authority that your regulatory body in your state has to operate in those markets differs, as well as the goals and the ways in which they want to operate within those markets. So I think that was important context that I felt we needed to lay out before having the discussion. Thanks, Kyle.
Certainly. Kristen, how do you cognize and think about this market?
So I would just like to start by saying I'm here just as an Oklahoman telling you about my experiences in Oklahoma. So disclaimer, these aren't the positions of the state of Oklahoma. But I come from, I think, a place that's called the Wild West of weed. In a lot of news stories, it's because we had a very low barrier to entry, $2,500 historically, and got up to about 14,000, nearly 14,000 licenses in the state. Through targeted enforcement and then the market conditions over time, we've gotten it down to 6,600, which is still quite a bit. And a lot of my work does center around how to get the cartels out of the state of Oklahoma. How do we make it not profitable for them to operate? Because they do operate in our license system under licenses through straw owners. But as well, the other big part of our enforcement push is to stop undercutting other markets with diversion. So last year we had a supply and demand study, and we found that the Oklahoma market, the supply is 62-1 for the demand. And I hear every time I talk to people from other states that their businesses are challenged by marijuana from Oklahoma coming there. In states that have no legal access to marijuana or cannabis, they also are finding that there's a substantial amount of cannabis grown from Oklahoma that is flooding their markets. So those things, stopping the external bleeding, but then it really stood out to me the way that the governor said, you know, we're trying to build a safe, equitable, and prosperous cannabis system in Illinois. I think that's true also in Oklahoma, and I hope that that would be the standard as we move towards federal legalization. But I do view those things in that order: safe for patients in Oklahoma, safe for the consumer that buys it through the historical market, particularly if that is cannabis that was sourced from an Oklahoma business that's licensed by my agency, equitable in that everyone has equal access and opportunity based on the conditions of their that they're coming to this market with, so that people of diverse backgrounds can succeed. Because in Oklahoma also, a large portion of our state is tribal reservation. And so we also have the intersection of tribal identities, tribal experiences, and allowing them to participate in the market is a big question, particularly after McGirt. But then also, at the end of the day, we want the businesses to be successful. We want the people who are doing the right thing and working really hard to have the market conditions. And that's, I think, my priority is through just common sense regulation. So the best practice, how do you codify that in rule? How do you get a best practice to become statute? And I've found that the things that a good, healthy business does are things that often cartels are not going to do. So highlighting enforcement, targeting enforcement on those things that the businesses are going to get right and the illicit operators aren't going to get right. I think that's where I see the priority in my work with enforcement.
Excellent. Paul, I'm turning to you next. How do you think about the cannabis market and all the permitted and unpermitted operators within it?
Thanks, Kyle, and good afternoon to everybody. By way of background a little bit, I had about 15 years of experience across state government in in enforcement as well as policy matters. And so kind of the way I bring it together is I think a lot of the enforcement around cannabis is really fundamentally a consumer protection issue. And I think that, obviously you have your cannabis regulators that are going to be doing the permitting, the inspecting, the licensing piece, which is not unlike a lot of the other professions that states regulate, or the facilities that they also regulate, like pharmacies and things of that nature. But another important piece of the consumer protection part of the enforcement is the attorneys general. And I spent about 8 years in the Illinois Attorney General's office and enforcing unfair and deceptive practice statutes, UDAP for short. And I think UDAPs have become an increasingly important tool for the AGs in the market. I'm looking at kind of three buckets of claims: deception claims, failure to disclose claims, and unfairness claims. And so I think when you start to see the way that the AGs are enforcing some of these statutes in the market, that's exactly what you're seeing. And you're seeing claims related to misrepresentation around the legality of products. And you're also, what's interesting is to see the unfairness claims. Unfairness is a little bit broader, more fluid, public policy violations, public health and violations, and just kind of general unscrupulous activity. And so when you see, for example, the Connecticut Attorney General's case, you see that kind of directed towards some of the conduct related to child marketing lookalike products towards children, things of that nature. And it's also what you see from the FTC. And the FTC statement recently with the FDA regarding some of the products, and so that's one important factor. Another thing about the AGs is the AGs wield an incredible amount of enforcement power in court, because the state regulators don't necessarily have the ability to go in court in the injunction. They can issue a cease and desist, but the teeth, I think, is really going to come through that enforcement power. And then lastly, on the consumer protection, I'll give a shout out to the banking regulators, which I think also hold an important role in just ensuring that the banked institutions, the institutions that are receiving financial services are properly licensed, and as well as holding, making sure that the institutions they regulate are checking those things for anti-money laundering purposes. And I think all this is happening within the environment of the legislative environment. It's really going to dictate kind of the rules of the road and the shape that takes, and each state is a little different. And obviously, we're all waiting with bated breath for the decision regarding rescheduling, and so that, I think, is going to have a trickle-down effect in the states as well. But I think the broad theme of consumer protection is an important part of the way that the cannabis enforcement is handled, and I look forward to discussing more of those factors in detail.
Thank you, Paul. You mentioned the FTC, FDA action. I don't know if anyone saw that. One of the more amusing and also terrifying products was it was called Slushers, and had high potency, I think, hemp-derived cannabinoids in it, which, if you have kids or nieces or nephews is the joke gets a little thin when you think about it. But those are very good points. So I'll next, Sean, how do you think about the various segments of the market?
Good afternoon. Is this better? There we go. Sorry about that. Good afternoon. Thank you again for having us. I would obviously echo the sentiments of my colleagues up here, and therefore not restate them and bore you to death, especially in the 3 o'clock hour. That said, I'll just sort of maybe zoom out a little bit, because I think it's important that we also come at these markets with a history in mind, and a history of this plant and enforcement around this plant, and bear in mind who your audience is at times. And so I've done, as my role, my former role as the Executive Director of the Cannabis Control Commission, I had that enforcement authority. I could certainly issue those cease and desist, those summary suspension orders. I could carry out those long investigations and obviously sit with some form of enforcement power that could either be settled before going to the commission for ratification, or actually brought before the commission in a formal hearing context. And so we had those teeth, we had those mechanisms and those traditional tools, but we also had policy, and we had an enabling statute with a mission embedded in it. And so I think, and I was sort of struck this morning by the governor's comment and tormented a bit when he said, obviously he's a competitive sort, and then rattled off the impressive Illinois numbers. I'm sitting in the back going, damn it. And because that competition is true from a social equity standpoint and from a market standpoint, what I think about when we think about the history of cannabis is there are folks that are operating in the illicit market, the gray market, the legacy market, that I want operating in our legal market. And through policy and through mission and through programming, I want to migrate them in. I do not want to kick their door in. And there's a contradiction in some ways in that enforcement mindset or sort of when we exercise those muscles. So me as a regulatory body, as an agency with that embedded mission, I might be hesitant to exercise those muscles. Whereas law enforcement and others that are colleagues of mine, peers of mine in government, those are the muscles that they exercise and have exercised historically. And importantly in there is in migrating those folks into the market, what we have to do is present and actually entice them in. And that's sometimes a difficult proposition to pose to someone is, what you're doing in the illicit market is not taxed. There's no overhead. But by all means, please, come with me. Here's the license fee. Here's the application fee. You have to go get background checked. I need your fingerprints while you're at it. If you have enough security cameras, you don't. We need some more of those as well. And I just think to myself, well, what am I doing to actually entice anyone to come into this marketplace because of the things that also I can't control, 280E. I have no control over that. We decoupled in Massachusetts, so a little bit of relief on the state side, but still, there's a challenge there. And so when I think about enforcement, I also have to put on my policy hat and think about, am I talking with the right language? Am I inviting enough? And what am I doing in my marketplace to maybe not use those muscles as a first impression, but also at the same time, when it comes to things like public health, safety, welfare, I will exercise those muscles. So if there's products in the market that are diverting into the illicit market, I want to know about that. I want to use the authority that I might have. But at all times, I think we have to stop and check ourselves as regulators at times and think, what is the appropriate hat I ought to be wearing today? And I hope you find in your experience, of course, interacting with regulators, that there's more of us that are out there that want to have those conversations and be engaged on that level. So, and again, we can talk more about that as we go along today. But again, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you all. So I'm going to move to the kind of more freewheeling part of our conversation. So my first question, for whoever wants to jump on it, is what carrots and sticks can cannabis regulators use with licensed operators?
I can start. First, I don't like the term sticks. I think there's a history of enforcement and we need to be careful about our terms. But I would say, what tools do regulators have? So I think it's important to recognize that not all states have approached this the same. So if you don't know about CANRA, we're a nonpartisan association that convenes governments. We have 45 states and 2 territories, as well as Canada and the Netherlands in our membership. Some of those states, when they legalized adult use, completely deprioritized enforcement. Full stop. Other states maintained pressure and enforcement, but I think regardless of how they started, everybody is sort of reassessing where they are now. There has been a move from really stringent enforcement on everything to more of an education-based approach, but you absolutely still have to have the ability to have some stringent enforcement. There are some states that have openly shared, even in the press, that if they enforced on everything in a really strict way, they wouldn't have any licensees left. So I think you have to acknowledge that you do need a market and that education needs to take place. But we have a lot of veteran adult use states now, and I think they would probably say grace periods for the most part are over, that education is important, but there's an expectation to meet certain standards, and there's limited patience in these established markets for operators that aren't meeting those standards. They have tools to help with enforcement. Most states are using things like track and trace to focus enforcement. They have surveillance teams, they have diversion and inversion teams now. And the other thing I would leave folks with, because I think we're in a bit of an era where folks are sort of ratting each other out and saying, hey, look what's happening over here. We're playing by the rules and they're not. Why aren't you doing anything about it? Enforcement takes time, and regulators have to follow really rigorous processes for investigations, because most investigations do have some litigation. And so just because you don't hear about something doesn't mean that the regulator isn't working on an investigation or an enforcement action in a particular place. But I think most of them want to start with education. They don't want to use stringent enforcement tools unless they're really egregious violations. But when there are, they need to take those seriously.
Can I jump in just to echo Jillian's point? And thank you, Jillian, for sharing that sentiment about things do take time. I often said to our staff when they would sometimes be demoralized by a Boston Globe story that's out there about why didn't the commission do anything about this? And meanwhile, the investigator's literally drowning in paperwork that maybe the licensee's law firm drowned us in. And as we're doing that, I keep saying it's not what we suspect, it's what we can prove. And if you go down that rabbit hole or you pull that thread and there's nothing there, then there's nothing there. And the challenge is that as that time goes by, there's an expectation that you're not doing anything, you're asleep at the wheel, or whatever the sort of the insulting analogy might be that day. But in reality, these things do take time. But importantly too, another philosophy that I tried to come at my former role was enforcement through education, because I do think that compliance itself is an educational opportunity, not just for licensees, by the way, but for regulators too. In some cases, we either inherited a statute that we're now trying to cure through regulation or manage through regulation. And I think there was also touched upon, the governor referenced that earlier this morning as well. Our ballot question was our baseline statute. So the legislature didn't write it, they rewrote it, of course, but they were given a less than perfect product to then try to get a little bit better, and then of course the regulations that we put into effect attempted to make that even better then. And so you're gradually trying to improve and hone and learn, but just bear in mind that we're learning sometimes, we as regulators now, me as a former regulator, are learning alongside you in some cases. But Kyle, to your original question as well, I think that educational opportunity is important in understanding and trying to suss out as best you can some form of intent. Was there an intent to violate the regulations here, or is this just sort of a mistake? And if it was a mistake, what corrections can we together put in place to sort of come to a settlement that I have confidence that when you continue your operations, you're going to do so compliantly? And the alternative, of course, is a blatant disregard for regulations, and we need to meet that with sort of an equal response. And I think that's where the carrot sort of analogy is really trying to manage through a conversation like what happened here. And in some cases, the cover-up is worse than the crime. And I was telling a story earlier today about there was a fine that was issued in Massachusetts over basically a single pre-roll being gifted to a parent across the counter. And it was a massive fine. That's the most expensive pre-roll in history. Reality, the cover-up was the challenge. It was don't talk to them. We don't have any security footage. It's sort of all, as you progressively go deeper down that single pre-roll, the price went up. But I think the reality was if we had a responsive licensee that said, all right, one employee made a mistake, they've been trained, they've been terminated, if it was egregious enough, what's the teachable moment through this? So I think philosophy is important too.
Kristen, what's your philosophy?
So I'd like to talk about just, I guess, one carrot to lend more towards the positive, because I think sometimes have a little bit of a jaded perspective dealing with cartels. But I think just engaging with the licensees in different contexts in different ways, so having community conversations where they can come and discuss what their concerns are with like higher level regulators, I think is really important. And then also public comments to rules. So when we implement our rules, when we do our rulemaking process, really digging into those comments, having conversations with people. The public comments in person can be really helpful because you're able to actually have like a back and forth discourse with people and pick into, you know, they use this word, what did they mean by that, and really get to a clear idea of what they're dealing with. And then also in my role, I work with, our agency has some dedicated law enforcement officers, and I work with them. One of the things that one of them has recently developed that we've found to be very fruitful is just going to businesses and talking to people, saying, hey, what issues are you experiencing? We're here for you. Oh, I saw, you know, there's this little deficiency on this manifest. This is an area for improvement for you. Like, this is the regulation. And just that education piece, but also the human piece, because I think with cannabis in general, the culture surrounding it is that it is so community focused. It really is more than maybe I'm familiar with in almost any other industry. And so just saying, you know, like, we're all in this thing together. We want you to succeed. Tell us what you need from us to make that happen. What are your pain points and how can we do better? I think is the carrot that I keep in mind.
Excellent. Paul?
I'd echo everything that's been said so far. I think what I've had is, you know, regulators are not looking for any gotchas. I mean, I think the ultimate goal is compliance. You know, in these enforcement contexts, a lot of the ways that the violations come up either are through routine inspections, or you're going to have something that's going to be complaint driven, that they're going to go out and start to look at those things. And in that context, what's really important is to have continuity of investigators, right? So because one, you're going to get the consistency, and two, the inspector is going to have visibility into the pattern of the operator, so that, you know, if there is an issue, that when they bring it back to the folks that are going to ultimately sign off on that discipline, they're able to articulate, you know, the basis of that pattern. It's also important because, you know, they have to figure out when to escalate these situations within management. A lot of the times, the inspectors are dealing directly with agents in charge and things like that. But, you know, sometimes these, you know, issues require more attention higher up in the organization, and that's especially the case if, you know, issues are seen across multiple dispensaries, and so they're able to bring that. But again, I think the goal is, ultimate goal is compliance. It doesn't do the state any good to shut a dispensary down while violations are being resolved. And I think, but another important piece is, you know, proactivity. You know, the state, at least Illinois, try to have an open door between the inspectors and the agents, so that if there's some type of issue, you know, maybe you could try to get some clarification on that. And another point, kind of on the carrot thing, is, you know, self-reporting. I think is fairly important, right? It's better to kind of be clear up front than to kind of deal with the problem on the back end before it gets worse.
Thank you. All great points. So let's say, hypothetically, we have a licensed operator with a compliance problem. Maybe one pre-roll was diverted, maybe a whole carton was. How can that licensed operator best position themselves with the regulator?
I'll attempt it if that's all right. Maybe the one pre-roll is not the best example on that one. I think definitely, to Paul's last point, proactivity is really valuable. Just reaching out, probably, and not making it. I got this question once about, like, how do you handle a crisis? And the way I answered it was simply, first determine if it is a crisis. Because I think sometimes we can make a crisis out of something that doesn't have to be. And so maybe the simple way to handle it is, if you do have a good relationship with your inspector, investigator, it's just that phone call to say, I need to raise this. Like, a red flag goes up in my mind from a compliance standpoint, so I want to at least put it on your radar. And they're not going to coach you through it. I had a lot of staff, and when we were hiring investigators at the Cannabis Control Commission too, you might think there was sort of a heavy law enforcement context. There really wasn't. It was minimal, to be honest. It was a lot of food safety, a lot of agricultural, a lot of pesticide application, a lot of building inspectors. So I really try to get practical experience, who also can kind of troubleshoot things. And they would tell me sometimes, I would say, what's your take on this question that I got, this hypothetical that I got? And sometimes it was from the lawyer, lobbyist, legislator, and their answer would be, I'm not answering that, I'm not their consultant. Oddly enough, now I'm their consultant. And I think the takeaway from me was I had to do some adjustment internally to say that you're not consulting. You're really, the question was, how do I comply? I like that question. That's a good question to get versus the, what do I do now? I broke it. And so I tried to get our staff to be proactive without crossing that line into this is how to do it, therefore if you rely upon it, you're immune. But instead really just the customer service side of things. And so my best advice would be the way to start is don't turn it into a crisis if it isn't one, but really run that analysis to determine, do I throw a red flag up here? And if I throw it up on myself, I think already like you're positive, you're net positive to start that engagement. So I think that's the healthiest way to go about it.
And I would add be solution focused. So
For sure.
try to figure out how you're going to avoid that in the future. I think a lot of the compliance issues, though, end up being a pattern of something. So I think this example is a tough one because it's not one that most regulators see. They see a pattern of something, and then they have to figure out, did this happen accidentally? Did this happen on purpose? How engaging is the licensee with us in trying to figure this out? And is this something that they're going to immediately correct on and show us that they're correcting on? Or is it something where, the pattern continues? I think that's the more maybe realistic approach.
And maybe just to build off that a little bit too, and back to the self-reporting aspect, determine first if you have an obligation to report. Because I've had a lot of people try to take the victory lap of, I self-reported. And my thought is, you had 24 hours to report it in the first place. You called me a week later. So your self-report was actually an admission. So instead of being the net positive, you're actually strike one. We're headed into strike two. So in your analysis, determine if it is a reportable event as well, especially when you're guiding clients through the what do I do here. Don't be afraid or don't be shy about reporting it, but also run that determination of, do I have to report this?
Yes, I'd just add to piggyback on that, more often than not, when there's a theft and loss diversion issue, something like that, people just don't check the rules or their attorneys haven't read the regulations as it pertains to their reporting obligations. So this may seem very obvious, but I would just say, someone's about to stand up a cannabis business, that would be something that would be useful for them to have on like a one-sheeter of these are my duties and obligations. Because more often than not, people are trying to, in my experience, reinvent the wheel when there's an established process that would be a lot less burdensome for them to undertake.
Paul, any? Okay, let's move to the next topic. Jillian, you said expertly, there's still a lot of legacy operation or unpermitted operation, going on, and some of those, as Kristen said, they can be cartels. Others can just be, maybe more small or potentially less armed operations. How does the history of prohibition and the war on drugs, which I think an earlier panelist described as the war on people with drugs, shape your attitude towards the legacy market?
Well, first, I don't see the legacy market as one that includes cartels. I think those are very different. And I think the approach that many regulators take to the legacy market is very different than the approach they take to the international drug trafficking market. There are many states that are proactively working with legacy operators, that are trying to work with third parties to build trust and community, to try to help those operators make a decision to come into the legal regulated space. And I think that's tough because we have to make that decision work out for these legacy operators. And this is a market where often it doesn't. I mean, even I was in a state meeting with legacy operators last year and hearing how much those legacy operators were paying to try to come into the regulated space, holding bank accounts where they're paying $2,000 a month and they don't yet have a license, trying to find a location and they don't yet have a license. I mean, that's tough. And I think there are a lot of regulators trying to figure out how to make that work out, because legacy operators in a number of states are really viewed as being a value add, which is very different than the cartel space and the international drug trafficking, which has happened in the US for a long time. But I do think that it has increased. I think, this is my personal opinion, not a Canada position, but after the 2018 Farm Bill, we did have a number of states have an increase in cartel activity because the regulation for hemp is very different, and it created an environment where international drug traffickers could come in, and they did this in my home state of Oregon. Clear-cut forests, build hoop houses overnight, say that they're growing hemp. Those operations had human trafficking. They had egregious environmental violations and land use violations. They had worker, treatment violations, and the state regulators don't often have authority to go outside of the regulated space. So in most instances, the state regulators have to go get other state agencies and sometimes other federal agencies, and it can be very dangerous. I mean, and there were good media reports about what happened in Southern Oregon. I mean, weapons, they needed to have law enforcement with them. Many of the operations, when they understood that law enforcement was happening, vanished overnight. So that's an entirely different, separate beast for a regulatory agency to handle, or for a state to handle, because again, often a regulatory agency doesn't have authority in that space. So just want to separate the legacy operators from the international drug trafficking operations, because I do think there's some big distinctions in how states approach those and in what those look like on the ground.
Just to build off that a little bit too, and sort of back to the question too of around sort of the incentives and sort of how you approach the illicit market and some of the legacy market especially. Again, that's where I have to mind my hats, is in one breath, in one instance, I am a regulator. I therefore have an obligation to be objective in all of my evaluations and to make sure that I'm giving everybody a fair and due process in their evaluation in the consideration of their license applications. And so in that sense, we are the umpire. We're calling balls and strikes. Sometimes you like the call, sometimes you don't, but I got to call the balls and strikes. The difference is, though, when somebody, through our social equity program, et cetera, this is where I changed my hat a little bit, we try to give them programming, we try to give them technical assistance. Massachusetts has finally put money aside for low interest loans, zero interest loans, grants, and preferably grants to social equity and economic empowerment applicants. Probably 5 years, 6 years too late, but I'm not going to sit here and judge them for giving money to folks that need it desperately and can also, as far as I'm concerned, deserve it, given our history. We also have to keep in mind that just because, for instance, you have a marijuana conviction in your background means you want to be a dispensary owner. It doesn't mean necessarily you want to own a cultivation facility. And so Massachusetts, for instance, set aside licenses for delivery courier, delivery operator, as well as social consumption licenses when they are in fact available for social equity and economic empowerment applicants. But to me, equity is not a license. It's not a license type. It's sort of a pursuit. And so that's why we also try to bring in ancillary businesses. I may have that conviction in my background, but now I'm in HVAC. I'm an electrician. I'm a technology specialist. And I can still work in this industry without needing a license. And so to Jillian's point, my jurisdiction went so far. And so how do I reach those folks and do good by them when I'll never see them again? So from a data collection standpoint, it's hard to sort of follow that progress and declare success. I care less about the credit of the success as far as if I see somebody that went through our program and they say, my business is booming now, I'm an HVAC specialist and I'm outfitting grows across the state. I think that's wonderful, but sort of how do I data collect that? And so I think the incentive part is, for regulators, it's kind of awkward, because like I said, someone steps up to the plate and I'm actively rooting for them. But I still have to call balls and strikes. And so how do I give the public the expectation and the assurance that I'm truly being objective when here I am running social media coverage of this applicant and trying to promote them as being viable as either an employee or an operator? It's a delicate dance we have to actually dance, but I think to Jillian's point too, we need more folks, sort of more peers of ours in government, to come to the table alongside us and do their part. And I think they're starting that. It's, at least in Massachusetts, from my experience, it's beginning to happen, which is great.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, you have to differentiate, the nature of the illicit market. I think, an open air drug market specializing in cannabis is, is a very different thing that, when you get maybe potentially firearms involved. It's well past a regulatory issue. I think, but in terms of Illinois and some of the enforcement priority, piece with respect to that, I think comes in the way that the funding of the program is structured, right? So, there's a certain waterfall that when the tax revenue goes into the state treasury, it goes down to various causes. Some of that's for the administration of the program. Some of that's for law enforcement. But as the governor mentioned this morning, a fair bit of it is hundreds of millions go to giving back to communities and trying to think using those monies to fund programming that gets to the roots of some of the issues in the violence and the historical disinvestment. So I think as opposed to prioritizing law enforcement resources, that's kind of how some of that's been handled in Illinois.
I just have one thought to the end of legacy operators. In Oklahoma, we found that the majority of patients buy at least a portion of the cannabis they consume from legacy operators outside of the license structure system. And so I think it's important just to note that culturally there is this element of community that people are looking for. They like to have these informal interactions. They like to be able to buy their cannabis from someone that they trust and know. And so I think as a regulator, just making sure that the extent to which that cannabis comes from the legal market and then is then diverted to the legacy operators, that it's been tested, that it's safe, that they're not ending up with the things that tested and couldn't be sold in the legal system is the big priority in terms of public health and safety. And then just to reiterate, the cartels are an entire horse of a different color. I don't think they're minded with community at all, and so there's not really a space for them to fit into the tapestry of legacy operator, licensed business, and then also just removing the barriers to access for people who do have marijuana-related convictions. So in Oklahoma, you can't be an employee if you've had certain convictions in the last either 2 or 5 years, and that's through recent credential legislation. And so those types of things are barriers that keep those people from being able to get into the business, apart from the cost associated with licensing, apart from the added cost of doing compliance testing and things like that, that they're not used to based on their historical operations.
I think there's one other illicit market that we haven't talked about, which I would classify as being sort of the newer illicit market that is hovering around the cannabinoid hemp market. And, I've met and talked with many responsible cannabinoid hemp producers, but there are also folks that are saying that they're selling hemp and their product has no cannabis, no part of cannabis in it at all. I would characterize these folks as being illicit operators that are sort of hiding in plain sight as hemp. These are folks that are often using counterfeit packaging. The packaging might have the California universal symbol on it. I think states are getting more creative about how to approach that. That is usually outside of what the regulatory agency would have. But we have states like California that's created a unified cannabis task force for enforcement. They, I believe last week, went in and seized a bunch of the packaging for these products. Apparently pallets and pallets of packages that had counterfeit packaging using the California universal symbol, not a state-regulated product. Who knows what product was destined for them? It was just the packaging. But I think states are trying to figure out how to get their arms around that because it becomes very difficult. The lines are very blurry when thinking about what belongs in which category now that we have so many categories. So I just wanted to raise that because I think that's another market that presents a lot of challenge for regulators in trying to figure out what to do.
Well, definitely, all excellent points. I think there's so many still remaining, real risks and dangers in the unpermitted market, and then there's a lot, of people, right? We want to help bring into the fold, and especially given the history of the industry. So this brings us to our kind of last question, which is: should regulators be concerned that aggressive approaches to operators, which sometimes are very warranted, could dissuade unlicensed or legacy operators from moving into the licensed market?
Yes and no. I guess I get to use the law school answer. It depends.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a true lawyerly question at
depends.
a true lawyerly venue, crafted that way.
Yes and no, because I do think there is room and there is absolutely space, and I think operators deserve a regulator that's going to regulate. That's why you pay your license fees. That's why you comply yourself. That's why you invest the time, energy, and resources you do into developing SOPs and training your staff around SOPs. And so I think if there were this sort of casual approach to regulatory work, especially enforcement, I think that's a disservice to the operators that are spending those valuable resources, time and energy to actually comply. And so in that sense, and I think it was mentioned earlier that I was on a panel in New York a couple of years ago, and I got a question similar to sort of an enforcement angle of like, well, how do you pick what you're going to actually enforce? And one of the things I said at the time was there was a room full of operators, and I said, I'm just going to shut up and listen to you, because you're all going to come up here afterward and rat on each other. And then I'm just going to go home and take my notes and say, go here, go here, go here. Because it was the early days where it was, well, they're getting away with it, so now either I do it or I rat on them. And if I rat on them and nothing happens, then I know I can get away with it too. And so I think that's where to not enforce and to not regulate, I think would be a disservice to those operators. But that's where I also think tone, tenor, personality, approachability, that customer service angle, that's where we have to, as regulators, have to turn that up. And also keep in mind that, again, like I mentioned at the outset, when we talk about cannabis and enforcement, for some people there's a very real historical lived experience there that we have to be very careful about and sensitive to. And that's where I think enticing folks in and migrating them into the legal market, I had a very honest conversation perhaps with myself at one point, which was I'm not the best ambassador at times for a cannabis program. I'm going into a community that doesn't know me, and I can go in there with all the best intentions, and I can go in there and say, I'm the new government agency, but I also need to carry and keep in mind that I'm carrying all the historical baggage of government. Whether I like it or not, my reputation in that instance was not earned, it was inherited. And I think the value is trying to understand and I think recognize that we as regulators are sort of entering an industry. We're at the forefront of a new industry, yes, but it's not a new industry. And it's one that has a very real harm behind it. And that's why I think we need to find ambassadors to help tell our story that sort of vouch for us in some of these communities. And that's why I think, we owe it to keep a very structured, objective enforcement tone to ourselves and as regulators. We also have to keep in mind that history has some pain to it and some context that's important too. So it's not an easy dance, but it's one that's worth, I guess, trying.
I feel like I'm often asked, like, what % of the illicit market capture is good, or how long should a state wait before they expect a certain capture of the illicit market? That question literally depends on hundreds of variables. It depends on opt-out. We've got states like California where 56% of the counties are opted out of the market, and you can't get rid of an illicit market when you have opt-out, and some of them are very geographically large. We've got some states that, for lots of reasons have had long timelines between when legalization happens and the market opens, and even if those are good reasons, what I have tended to observe in watching this landscape over the past, 10, 15 years is that does tend to embolden an illicit market the longer you are, and then once you open your market, usually that displaces it, but all of the math has to work out for that to displace it as well. And so I think it's not an easy question to answer. We have limited data sources as well. It's interesting we're not talking about data as part of this, but that's a question we talk a lot about at CANRA. How can you measure the size of your illicit market? That's such a hard question now. And that makes it even harder to sort of know, where are we? Are we capturing that market? Are we not? What are we classifying in that market? Because there are all these markets, some of which are regulated, others are not. So I think this entire topic has many subtopics within it, and there's no easy question. Certainly not sort of what's the impact of unlicensed operators on the licensed market. I think that's got a lot packed into it.
To this end, I would just say honesty, transparency, and priorities and outcomes. So I deal with a lot of our open records requests, and I would say there's a lot of interest in the agreements that are reached, so people can understand, if I engage in this type of conduct, this is going to be the outcome, and that being predictable, that being not arbitrary, and that being proportionate to the nature of the violation, and then also the investigation that goes into that, I think just shows them, this is a predictable body that's going to act this way. I can expect that if I do something wrong, I'm going to be treated fairly and in a way that's proportionate to what I've done. And I think that more goes to something that's just, a human thing. And that transparency, I think, can induce people potentially, if there aren't the disqualifying and financial barriers, to more willingly participate in a market if they know what they're going to get.
I would say I think a lot of the deterrence of entering the market comes in on the front end. Folks aren't even able to get into the market at all. I think we in Illinois we had a fairly robust application process that was very intensive, very expensive, and I think that served as a barrier. So I think the more that the states could do to eliminate the barriers to entry. So, for example, in the last application round for dispensary licenses, made it a much easier process to do on the front end. Pay a reasonable application fee. You go into a lottery, and then you're vetted on the back end. So I think making it a lot simpler gets folks into the market in the first place.
I would just, to sort of piggyback a little bit too, is, and this is more, I think, advice or maybe wisdom earned over time, is especially for this audience, is don't be afraid to engage or sort of push back on a regulator even. Obviously, delicately maybe, politely perhaps, but...
I was going to say, careful, Sean.
Yeah, well, hey, former regulator, I can say it now. I've been liberated.
How that turns tables.
Yeah, right. Call me. The reason, though, is I think we can get it wrong sometimes, and maybe on the margins. And I think what I found is that, in my experience at least, is people would sort of come to my office, the principal's office, and as if they're there like to sort of kiss a ring or something. And in reality, I want a conversation. I want to know, did we interpret this correctly or incorrectly, in your opinion? And obviously, it's almost like a mini hearing of sorts. But I would tell folks, too, is you're here at the table to sort of negotiate with me, and so we can settle this. Or, of course, I can put it on a commission agenda, and we can talk about it in public, and you can take your chance with my 5 bosses who are public figures and sort of public appointees. And so the incentive is there to have that conversation where, think about like you're trying to settle some sort of criminal case as far as like, can we plead this out as something less than? Or can you sort of drop this because we think you've misinterpreted something? You'd be surprised, I'd imagine, how open regulators are, at least I hope. This is so new, and some of these things are very first impression. Don't sort of just, and I'm sure you won't, obviously you've got to zealously represent your clients, but doing that sometimes can bring some tense conversations, but I would invite those because I think we all get better, and we get better rules as a result. So, and more consistent enforcement too over time.
Yeah, and just echoing that your regulators they're just doing their jobs. They're humans.
Exactly.
They're not out to get you, I promise. They actually get death threats for their work. I've had death threats. It's very real. I've never seen public figures that have more mistreatment than your cannabis regulators. So I think if you approach them and are open and kind and respectful in your conversations, it goes a long way, because there are a lot of folks that don't.
Yeah. Quick anecdote along those same lines is I once recently had a police cruiser stationed up front of my house because of those exact threats. So they're real, and obviously in today's day and age they're very scary. But also I think some of that is because we are characters to some people. We're not people. And I think once you get to know us, and maybe, sorry, it's a little sappy, but we're people too, and we have feelings and things like that. So, but also we're human. We can sometimes screw things up as well. So again, the advice is really don't be afraid to politely and don't be afraid to engage. Is probably the takeaway.
On that note, it's time for question and answers. So please don't be afraid to engage.
Never mind.
Hi there. I'm Charles, and I guess I'm one of those hemp guys. I'm the executive director of the Illinois Hemp Business Association. We also work with a bunch of other associations all around the country. Regarding hemp-based cannabinoids, the challenge that we see, because we believe we represent the responsible hemp businesses that want regulation, there's a lot of moving parts. One is there's a lobbying effort from the other end that tries to criminalize us and make us look like we're trying to poison children. Oftentimes in the Illinois area, my face is interposed across the face of a Cresco or an MSO spokesperson, and then packages of Trips Ahoy or Doritos or these other sorts of things that nobody wants. And really what I'd like to do is it's important for us to kind of reach out, because we're fortunate in Illinois that we have a very knowledgeable legislature and good regulatory bodies that have been able to resist the pressure. But in other states where it hasn't, it's become a complete mess. Right now, as an industry, we're trying to self-regulate, and we're dealing a problem with Maryland, where after the passage of a ban disguised as regulation, the industry filed an injunction. And Maryland now has become the bad actor capital of the world for hemp cannabinoids, because being an injunction state, no one can do anything. So all these Trips Ahoy and Dorito manufacturers are literally, it's like The Wire, if you guys remember that episode where you can't do anything in Maryland. And we also have similar problems in Florida, where the hemp industry was essentially sandwiched to work with a veto to stop that. And now the hemp industry is actually going to be opposing a recreational amendment, which is kind of a big mess to deal with. And finally, New York, we're having problems where hemp operators are actually being raided by armed soldiers and being thrown in jail, and then after the fact being told, oh, we screwed up, sorry, we thought you were a bodega, but you were actually a licensed hemp operator. So many of these things in other states are kind of like well-intentioned regulations gone wrong, and our hope is also to engage with regulators so that we can put together responsible regulations that help everybody create equity and access for all and level the playing field between both hemp cannabinoids and cannabis side of things. So, wrapping all this together, the question is, how do responsible hemp businesses reach out amidst all the noise, separate themselves from, cartels disguising behind a hemp license or bad actors, disguising behind a hemp license, while also recognizing that, on the regulated hedge fund funded cannabis side, they outgun us 10-1, and they just want to eliminate us as competition.
So first of all, CANRA doesn't talk about any individual states. Like, you should talk with their regulators. We do work with trade associations across the board. I regularly talk with a number of trade associations at the national level for hemp. U.S. Hemp Authority, U.S. Hemp Roundtable, all the big 3 or 4 hemp associations we are in regular contact with to talk about how policy should go forward and what they're hearing from their members. We don't dictate policy for our state at all. What we've said, though, is that we do think that states should have the right to decide what happens in their state, because the feds aren't doing anything in this landscape. And as you mentioned, it is very difficult right now for states to figure out who's a good operator, who's trying to play by the rules, who wants to be regulated, who's not, who's somewhere in between. Do we have authority to do anything with that? It's tough. So I don't envy your position. I understand where you're coming from. We don't work with state trade associations, but if you wrap up into a national trade association, I'd love to know which one to make sure we're in touch with them. But I want to hear any and all solutions to this, because it's really tough for regulators on the ground. And we convene hemp regulators as well. So we convene both cannabis and hemp. And it's hard for both of them to figure out what bucket does this go in. We have states in our membership that only regulate hemp, that don't have a medical or adult use program. So they're trying to figure out, is this not a hemp product? Is this an illicit marijuana product? We've got states that have banned hemp but have marijuana that are seeing inversion, and they're trying to, it's tough, because ultimately, as somebody said earlier, like, it does all come from cannabis sativa. You can make a lot of the same products from it, and we have these kind of arbitrary lines of like, well, if it came from this, it's over here. If it came from that, it's over there. But it's really difficult sometimes to know. So we're all ears, would love to hear what you think should happen in this space. Please find me after.
Just to echo the same sentiment, but I think maybe give a tangible example. I think there is a real risk of overreaction in the hemp space right now, especially on the intoxicating hemp and the cannabinoid space. The reaction is going to come from folks that maybe don't even understand the legal distinction between the two, never mind the botanical distinction. And I think that the challenge is that those are folks that actually have the power to make laws. And so an example is back in Massachusetts, we've seen sort of this trend of we've got to do something. And then the do something is where I start to get worried, because I'm thinking, well, this is the first time I've heard you say hemp, and now you're going to regulate it in some way, shape, or form. And it was any synthetics. We got to get rid of any synthetics. And it's, well, you just get rid of CBN. I don't think you want to do that, but that's in a way how you create. You can derive it naturally, but you're not going to derive enough. So you've got to sort of, what's your nuanced sweet spot on some of this? And so to your question, I think you're doing the things that I would recommend that you do, which is sort of organizing as we are genuine hemp farmers and hemp producers that truly are doing it as craft, but also we can create a distinction between ourselves and those bad actors. We don't want those bad actors in this space as well. And sort of who can you join forces with to sort of grow your voice or sort of grow your reach in a way that maybe you're developing ambassadors that, and I think especially with legislators in particular, because this is truly going to become, I think, a legislative issue at the state level across the country before it becomes a federal solution in any way, including, I think, around some of the Farm Bill stuff. But there's a lot of risk, I think, in the hemp cannabinoid space, simply because folks don't truly get the nuance. And that scares the crap out of me, because I think there's a lot of really great products in the cannabis space that are benefiting from sort of that infused hemp ingredient, ultimately.
Well, thank you so much. Excellent points, excellent questions.